I'd like to welcome you to this program. A good friend of mine asked me if I would produce this, so we're going to do it. What I find fascinating about this broadcast will be the fact that there was a time when Romanism would come right out in your face through various machinery, the Inquisition and the wars that they pushed governments to pursue. Today, Rome goes behind the scenes. As Great Controversy says, they present a fair front to the world, behind which all their former atrocities are still done to humanity. We're going to find today in our study of Stalin, or as FDR called him, Uncle Joe, we're going to see that Joseph Stalin was actually a puppet of the Jesuit order, and that all the atrocities that he committed both in Russia and throughout the world were to promote and push the Jesuit agenda for this earth. Before we get into our study, though, let's kneel for prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for your love to us. Thank you that we can study this topic today. We pray for the Holy Spirit to be our guide and our strength. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, I'm so grateful for the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, especially the book, The Great Controversy, because it makes so clear that Bible prophecy still shines as a light in a very dark place. And I'm thankful for the light of prophecy today. Uncle Joe, here we go. The Bolshevik bloodhound. So much speculation surrounds this bloody man of Moscow. That many people died during his rule is without question. Exactly how many remains uncertain. Folk, I've read accounts where conservative historians say around 25 million people died as a result of this man right here, Joseph Stalin. The more liberal historians would say it's upwards of 50 million people. That kind of carnage, we cannot even fathom. Millions of people were killed during his bloody regime. Between 25 and 50 million people. Stalin's early upbringing is also widely disputed. I've read different accounts. Some say he grew up rich. Some say he grew up poor. Some say he grew up as a Roman Catholic. Others say he grew up in the Greek or the Russian Orthodox Church. So there's a vast amount of information about Stalin's birth, but it's all contradictory, so you really can't pinpoint anything as it relates to his upbringing. Some say his dad was rich, some poor. Some say his dad was a priest, others say he was a cobbler. Due to these wide discrepancies, we're not going to look in detail at his early years. We're just not. About the first thing, though, that every historian agrees on is the college education that he had at Tiflis Orthodox University. And there is no doubt that it was controlled by the Jesuits. You see, some of the Alexanders in the 19th century, Alexander I and Alexander II, both Romanov czars, both of them sought to expel the Jesuits from Russia. They expelled some of them, but not all of them. One of the places where they remained was in Tiflis University. We read this from the book Murder in the Vatican by Avril Manhattan, pages 25 and 26. Manhattan said, Monsignor Gregory Agaganian, Patriarch of the Catholic Rite of the Armenian Church, who was elevated by the ex-Jesuit Pope Pius XI to the Patriarch in 1937, a post which he held for 25 years. In 1946, anti-communist Pope Pius XII made him a cardinal. Cardinal Agaginian was expected to play a major role during the developing Cold War. The reason was that Agaginian was the top expert on the Soviet Union, communism, and the Orthodox Church. He was of Armenian origin, but a Georgian by birth. He had known communism at first hand, having lived 3 difficult years as a young priest in Tiflis, Georgia, while the Bolshevik Revolution was raging. He spoke fluent Russian. Now we read these words in the blue. Agaginian was also considered very special by Stalin himself, as both Stalin had been educated by and Rasputin had been advised by the rector of the order's Orthodox Tiflis Theological Seminary. So we read here in Avril Manhattan's words that the Jesuit order controlled Tiflis Theological Seminary. Even though it was called Orthodox, the Jesuit order controlled it and what was taught there. The cardinal, having had the dubious distinction of attending the same Jesuit seminary, though called Russian Orthodox in name, in Georgia, as Stalin had done. This was a small but significant fact. Now, how can we know for sure? Well, there's several points that we will see. The greatest point of all to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt of the Jesuits' control and the teachings that Stalin imbibed at Tiflis University is the very fact that everything in Stalin's afterlife breathes Jesuitism and the training that he received there. Everything. And we're going to see that as this program proceeds. Another source giving testament to Tiflis being under the Jesuits comes from Joseph Stalin, a short biography by G.F. Alexandrov, published in 1947. We read these words. The Jesuitical regime that reigned in the seminary aroused in Stalin a burning sense of protest and strengthened his revolutionary sentiments. At the age of 15, Stalin became a revolutionary. And from Stalin himself, he openly admitted the Jesuit control of the institution in his famous interview with Jewish journalist Emil Ludwig Cohen. Cohen asked, and this is all in Alexandrov's book, Stalin, A Short Biography. Ludwig said, "What impelled you to become an oppositionist? Was it perhaps the bad treatment by your parents?" "No," Stalin said. "My parents were uneducated, but they did not treat me badly by any means. It was a different matter at the Orthodox Theological Seminary, which I was then attending." Now, Stalin's talking about Tiflis University here. He goes on, and this is what he says. "In protest against the outrageous regime and the Jesuitical methods prevalent at the seminary, I was ready to become and did become a revolutionary, a believer in Marxism as a really revolutionary teaching. What methods were prevalent? What teachings were prevalent at Tiflis University? Well, Stalin says it. It was Jesuitical methods. The Jesuits controlled Tiflis when Stalin was there. Do you not admit that the Jesuits have good points? Stalin, yes, they are systematic and persevering in working to achieve sordid ends. Fascinating that Stalin would say the Jesuits look to achieve sordid ends, because that's exactly what the Jesuits led Stalin to do. Their principal method is spying, prying, worming their way into people's souls and outraging their feelings. What good can there be in that? For instance, the spying in the hostel. At 9 o'clock, the bell rings for morning tea. We go to the dining room. When we return to our rooms, we find that meantime a search has been made and all our chests have been ransacked. What good point can there be in that? The Jesuit generals rule through provincial government. The article did not say the Jesuit general himself was in Russia. His subordinates, however, were indeed in Russia during the time when Stalin was at Tiflis. Stalin would take what he learned from the Jesuits at Tiflis University and become a Marxist communist for the rest of his life. He used his communistic leanings to fulfill the purposes of the Jesuits all over the world. You say, wait a minute. He denounced Jesuitism at Tiflis. He became a Marxist. He became a communist. Yeah. I'm glad you saw that, friend. Well, where does communism and Marxism, where does it come from? Where do those principles of communism come from? Where did it have its origins? Well, it was on the reductions in Paraguay that the principles of Marxism and communism were perfected. These principles the Jesuits then incorporated into Russia, China, and much of the world. These were the principles Stalin was taught at Tiflis and that he instituted in Russia following the death of Nikolai Lenin. You see, friend, the facts of history tell us in the 16th and 17th centuries, in Paraguay, on the communal lands that the Jesuits owned, they ran what they called reductions. And the Jesuits controlled these reductions. They controlled everything that went on. The people did all the work, and from their work and from the products that they produced, the Jesuits then sold those throughout Europe and made billions and billions of dollars. If you go to Boyd Garrett's book, Rome Stoops to Conquer, Boyd Barrett, he makes it very, very clear. So the Jesuits became so wealthy from their reductions in Paraguay. But they perfected the principles of communism. The people had just enough to eat. They had just enough entertainment. But their life was completely dominated on these reductions. In fact, in R.W. Thompson's book, Footprints of the Jesuits, pages 176 and 177, we read these words: "The principles of socialism or communism governed all the reductions. Everything necessary to the material comfort and prosperity of the Indians was in common. Each family had a portion of land set apart for cultivation. They learned trades. They became experts. But the earnings of the whole were deposited in common storehouses at each reduction and distributed by the Jesuits in such portions to each individual as necessity required. Even meat was portioned from the public slaughterhouses in the same way. The surplus produce remaining after these distributions was sent to Europe and sold or exchanged for wares and merchandise solely at the discretion of the Jesuits. Everything was conducted in obedience to them, and nothing contrary to their orders was tolerated. Houses of worship, college, palatial residence for the Jesuit fathers were built by the common labor and at the expense of the common treasury. Suffrage was universal, but the sanction of the Jesuits was necessary to the validity of the election. In fact, says Niccolini, the Jesuits substituted themselves for the state or community, a fact which fully establishes the monarchical, theocratic character of the government. So the principles of communism were perfected on these reductions in Paraguay in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was then that Adam Weishaupt, the trained Jesuit from Ingolstadt University, the founder of Illuminism, Weishaupt sought to incorporate the principles of communism. They wanted to try them out, so they were tried during the French Revolution. And it was during the time of the French Revolution that the principles of communism were actually placed down in writing by a group called the League of Just Men. From there, some 50 years later, the League of Just Men passed on those principles of communism, gave them to two Jews, and said, put these writings into a book. The two Jews that were used by the Jesuits were Karl Marx and Joseph Goebbels. The book that they produced was called the Communist Manifesto. And after the manifesto was written, they began to seek to instill those principles into nations. Russia, China, Korea, Vietnam, and on and on and on. But it all had its beginning on the reductions in Paraguay. Stalin's life work, the Bible is very clear, Matthew 7:16-20. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. So what were, number one, Joseph Stalin, who claimed to shun the principles of Jesuitism, but he used their very political philosophy to reign over Russia for some 30 plus years. So while Stalin can tell us till the cows come home that he ran away from Jesuitism and into the arms of communism, he was actually using the very principles of government that the Jesuits wanted him to use. So what were the fruits? What were the fruits of this bloodhound this madman of Moscow? Well, before Stalin and the Jesuits could create a communist regime in Russia, the Romanov family that had ruled Russia for centuries had to be removed. Alexander I, Alexander II, and Nicholas had all sought to bring about constitutional reforms in Russia. That was a no-no. A government based on liberty was a no-no in the eyes of Rome. The Romanov family had to go. The Jesuits would not tolerate constitutional reform in Russia. All three of these rulers had assassination attempts made on their lives. Each one, Alexander I, II, and Nicholas, each one was killed prematurely by the Jesuits who hated them. Stalin was one of the many Jesuit puppets that wanted the Tsarist system destroyed. And it was as Stalin and the Bolsheviks sought to create a revolution, and they did in Russia. It was during the time of that revolution that Tsar Nicholas and his family were assassinated. Now, of course, there are some amazing stories about possibly the survival of one of Nicholas's daughters by the name of Anastasia. And we're not here to argue her living on after this assassination of the family for a picture, but I've heard stories. Attacks on the Romanov family. Here we go. From R.W. Thompson's book again, The Footprints of the Jesuits. The Russian Emperor Alexander I was compelled to issue a royal decree in 1816 by which he expelled the Jesuits from St. Petersburg and Moscow. This proving ineffectual, he issued another in 1820, excluding them entirely from the Russian dominions. See, that was a no-no. Alexander I sought to expel the Jesuits out of Russia for their insurrection, for their rebellion, for their attempts to take over the Russian nation. 5 years later, Alexander was poisoned to death in 1825. The Tsars were under Jesuit attack. Alexander, too, broke all diplomatic ties with Rome in 1877 and even proposed a constitution. Alexander, too, had progressed well with his great reforms and had attached his signature to a constitution to be adopted by Russia. The next day, a bomb was thrown at his carriage, which killed and wounded a number of Cossacks who accompanied the carriage. The emperor, in deep sympathy, left the carriage to look at the dying men when a second bomb blew him to pieces. That's taken from Arno Gabellian's Conflict of the Ages, The Exhorters, page 85. So the Jesuits had the Romanov family in their crosshairs. And the final three czars, Alexander I, Alexander II, and Tsar Nicholas, all three were assassinated by the Jesuit order. Why? Because they had big plans for Mother Russia, as the 20th and 21st century has made very clear. Well, so Stalin incorporated Marxism, wanted to have communism rule Russia. He was part of the planning and the plotting to kill Nicholas II to completely exterminate the Romanov family so that communism could have its sway in Russia. So 2 parts so far in Stalin's life tell us of the Jesuits' control over his reign. He was a Marxist. He was a communist. The Jesuits perfected those principles. He wanted to eliminate and destroy the Romanov family. He did that. Those are 2 points we see in Stalin's life. Number 3, in order to carry out a successful revolution, as the Bolsheviks hoped to do, as Stalin hoped to do, they would need lots and lots of money. Well, where would you get it? Where would Stalin and the Bolsheviks get this money? The Bolsheviks and Stalin would need to be fed, they'd need to be clothed, they'd need to be armed in order to overthrow the Romanovs. Where would they get millions and millions of dollars needed in order to place communism on the throne of vast Russia? Where did they get it? They turned to Jesuit agents in the United States of America. Money, money, money. From Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, it says this: William Franklin Sands, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had just contributed $1 million to the Bolsheviks. You say $1 million doesn't go that far today, but folk, we're not talking about today. We're talking about 100 years ago. And back then, $1 million went a long way. But it didn't stop there. Jacob Schiff was the principal Jesuit in America who was assigned the task of taking over the American banking system and establishing the Federal Reserve. Schiff came to America in the late 1800s with orders from the Rothschilds to get control of the American banking system. By the turn of the century, 1900, Schiff had mastery of the entire banking fraternity on Wall Street. That's from Myron Fagan's tape lecture called The Illuminati and the Council on Foreign Relations. As Myron Fagan brought out, friends, Jacob Schiff came to the United States the latter half of the 19th century. Jacob Schiff was a brilliant financier, and he came to America with Rothschild Jesuit money. And Jacob Schiff would use that money to buy off wicked men who would be ready to sell their souls. He found people like the Rockefellers, Morgans, Leland Stanford, Andrew Carnegie. Friends, through just those 4 names I've just mentioned, Jacob Schiff was able to buy out and gain control of a huge amount of the American economy. So much so that, as Myron Fagan said, that by 1900, Schiff had mastery of the entire banking fraternity on Wall Street. Now, from Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, we read these words: Since Schiff had control of the Federal Reserve Bank, he now had a source of money to finance the communist revolution in Russia. In the February 3, 1949 issue of the New York Journal American, Jacob Schiff's grandson, John, was quoted by columnist Choli Knickerbocker as saying that his grandfather, Jacob Schiff, had given about $20 million for the triumph of communism in Russia. So where did Stalin, where did Lenin, where did they get their money? To fight the Bolshevik Revolution? To establish a completely new government system? They got it from the Jesuits on Wall Street. Jacob Schiff got Rothschild Jesuit money to take over the American banking system, and then took American money and gave it to the Bolsheviks, gave it to Joseph Stalin. So Stalin used communism. That was his ideology for government. He destroyed the Romanov family, and he used Jesuit money to build an Russian empire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. Jacob Schiff brought Rothschild Jesuit money to America after the Civil War. For anyone who doubts the connection of the Rothschild and the Jesuits, in the Jewish Encyclopedia, page 161, it says, aware that the Rothschilds are an important Jewish family, I looked them up. I looked them up in the Jewish Encyclopedia, and I saw that they were known as the guardians of the Vatican's treasury. So the Rothschilds and the papacy are one, friends. They are one. This money was used to gain control over J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, Carnegie, Pullman, Stanford, DuPont, and others. These men sold their souls to Schiff and the Jesuit Consortium. Thereafter, while claiming to be Americans, these wealthy men bent every nerve at taking over the world for Rome and the Jesuits. They lived in America but did what was best for Rome. Thus, Americans financed the communistic Bolsheviks. Facts of history, friend. Facts of history. Now, it's very interesting that here Joseph Stalin, he knocks out the Romanov family, establishes the Jesuit model for world government in communism. Joseph Stalin and the Jesuits realized also, if we can knock out the Romanov family, not only can we set up our new form of government, the kind we want with communistic principles, but it was the Romanov family that protected the Russian Orthodox Church. And if the Russian Orthodox Church could be destroyed, could be assimilated into Romanism, well, you've just cracked two birds with one stone. That's exactly, friend, what happened. The Tsar was the protector of the Orthodox Church. This had been the case for over 1,000 years. With the overthrow of the Tsar, it would inevitably bring about the overthrow of the Orthodox Church. The papacy wanted this badly. Thus, with the end of the Romanov family would come the downfall of the Russian Orthodox Church. Cracked two birds with one stone. We read from Avro Manhattan's book, The Vatican Billions, Chick Publications, 120 and 121. The overthrow of the Tsarist system, therefore, brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the established Orthodox Church. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, friends, this war had been raging for 1,000 years. The downfall of her millenarian rival was too good to be true. You knock out the Tsar, You've knocked out the Orthodox Church. But it's fascinating, friends. The Russian Orthodox Church is still with us today. It didn't disappear. It started off, whereas we're going to see, many, many people, Russian Orthodox people, were killed by Stalin. But after they did that for a while, then the Orthodox children came up. Well, they didn't want to fight anymore. So what happened? They just did whatever the Jesuits told them to do. So that today, the Russian Orthodox Church is as big and strong as it's ever been. Yeah. But now it promotes Romanism. It promotes Romanism. The instruments of this new alliance between the Soviets and the Vatican were to be the Jesuits, described as the hereditary enemies of the Orthodox Church. Reportedly, there were large numbers of representatives of the Jesuit order in Moscow during the revolution. That's from Zatko's book, Descent into Darkness. And here from Arno Gabilian's book again, The Conflict of the Ages, pages 103 to 106, among the 1.766 million victims up to the beginning of 1922, figures obtained from Soviet documents, nearly 5,000 were priests, teachers, nuns of the Orthodox Church. That's only by 1922, friend. Lenin is still alive. They were slaughtering the Orthodox people. Nearly 100,000 Lutherans banished. Whole villages were wiped out. Thousands of churches of the different branches have been demolished. And the work of destruction goes on. Oh yes, friend. Wherefore, by their fruits you shall know them. Stalin's aim was the destruction of the Romanov family, the Orthodox Church, and all Protestant churches, as we see in these statements. Stalin kicked it into high gear in 1939 when he began the outlawing of the Russian Orthodox Church, seizing thousands of schools and churches to be put in the hands of the Catholic Church. The history books report that Christianity was banned in Russia under the communists. But this was not the case with the Jesuits. They remained in Russian territory. A greatly suppressed fact is that the head of Stalin's death camps in Siberia was none other than Cardinal Agaginian, his classmate at Tiflis. Together, these sinister Roman Catholic classmates would kill tens of millions of people in their death camps. And sadly, this information has barely seen the light of day. Oh, friends, only in eternity will we be able to see the records and the horrible cruelties of this Jesuit monster in Moscow. You know, I read several accounts. FDR provided Stalin with weaponry, trucks, money, everything else during and after the war. But why did he do that? That just blows my mind. A man professing to be a leader of the Republic of the United States, a freedom-loving nation with a constitution. How could FDR support Joseph Stalin? That just seems so crazy because Stalin was a Marxist. Well, the fact of the matter is, friend, FDR worked for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Jesuit front organization. Stalin worked for the Jesuits. They both worked for the same people. Therefore, Stalin helped the man that he called Uncle Joe. This bloodthirsty man, FDR called Uncle Joe. The unlikely cooperation between the capitalist and the communist, the product of human warmth and trust, created the flawed but essential United Nations. Roosevelt and Stalin grinned and charmed and arm-twisted their way to victory in the world beyond the war. Their cooperation is not unlikely at all. Roosevelt and war movies all celebrated the Soviet Union as America's ally, and in particular depicted Joseph Stalin as a wonderful man, Uncle Joe. Well, from what I was able to study about Romania, Romania was one of the top nations to fully imbibe the communistic principles that that Russia began to promote beyond her borders. And the Romanians, for many decades, had communism within their government. This man right here, whose name I cannot pronounce, Georgiu Dej. Romania was softened up by the brutal police state of this man, and here he is right here. This is what I got from the internet, from several websites. He was involved in communist movements, activities from the early 30s. Upon the outbreak of World War II, he was imprisoned by Antonescu's regime, but he escaped in 1944. Says together with Prime Minister Petru Groza, pressured the king into abdicating, marking the onset of out-and-out communist rule in Romania. Under his rule, this man right here, Romania was considered one of the Soviet Union's most loyal satellite states. So, Romania and the government of Romania was heavily influenced by Stalin, by Russia, and many of the same things on a lesser level were seen in Romania as they were seen in the Soviet Union. During the time of Ceausescu, who came into power, I believe, in the 1960s, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people were brutally killed under the reign of communist dictator Ceausescu. And there is Ceausescu. From Wikipedia, we find these words: during the relative liberalization of the 60s, sporadic talks between the Holy See and the Romanian state were carried out over the status of Greek Catholic possessions, but without any significant result. However, Romania became a Jesuit province by 1974. The situation normalized soon after the Romanian Revolution of 1989. Links with the Holy See were resumed in May of 1990. Romania was the fourth formerly Eastern Bloc country and first minority Catholic country to allow this, after the majority Catholic Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. So, through communism, through assassination, the Jesuits used that first man, Georgiu Dej, and then Ceausescu, to inculcate communism